Welcome to the Private Lenders Podcast with your hosts from Hard Money Bankers, Jason Balin and Chris Haddon. This podcast is sponsored by hardmoneymastermind.com.
Hey everyone, Chris and Jason here. Thank you for checking out the show. Today we're discussing, should you lend on your own or invest with a professional private lending company? We're going to dive into all that in 1 second. Just a real quick announcement. We recently released that we are having our first annual summer event here in Maryland. In order to learn more, this is all just coming out, getting planned, starting to sign people up. We have put it out on our socials and email list, but just very recently. So as soon as you can, go check out hardmoneymastermindevent.com. Okay. Man, this is an important topic because we've seen a lot of people do it wrong. We're going to break it down. Like the concept is that you can invest with a lending company. Like a lot of the people in the mastermind group, us, pro lending company is what you do full time. And you could probably make a rate of return in the neighborhood of like 9-10%. You don't have to do anything. It's passive. And that's pretty good. Pretty damn good. You could also do loans on your own where you're making something like 12% or 13% plus some points and fees. Higher rate of return, but then it's all up to you. You got to communicate with borrowers, underwrite, screen people, paper the whole deal, service it, send people 1099s and 1098s like we were just doing. You got to do a lot of stuff. That's for some people. It's not for everybody.
Yeah. And I think that's hard to determine up front, right? Because it's like, oh, I want to get into this lending space. I have some of my own capital, or I know people that have capital. I want to do it. And then I think a lot of lenders realize like it's a full-time job and it's serious. And it's not just like, hey, here, I have a few borrowers I'm going to lend them money to. Like there is a lot that goes on. And I guess the question is to ask yourself is, do you want to be an active investor or a passive investor? Because that's what it is. And yeah. And Chris, although like mentioned, hey, you can get 13, 14% plus points if you're doing the deals and being active, like you could potentially accomplish a 20% rate of return gross with that, right? You churn the money twice a year. I mean, we're lending out at 13 and 3, so that's 16% annualized if the money's out once. We have some miscellaneous fees as well that bumps that. Plus, if the money's, if you're churning the points more than once a year, so it ends up being 9 or 10% passive, 20% ish if you're active. But that's gross active, right? Like there's expenses that's not just time consuming that comes into that, and there's just like any other business. And I think what I think a lot of investors and lenders realize is they get into this space. Let's say they're self-funded and they have their own capital. Let's say they're a few $1 million, and they get in this space and they're like, wow, like this is a real business. And yeah, I can achieve a higher rate of return on my personal capital than I can anywhere else for the most part. But like it's taking me time and energy to do so. And what ends up happening is they're taking away time from maybe their core business if they're not retired and they're still in a core business. And they're taking time and attention away from that, and that might be slacking. It reminds me of a story of a real estate investor that we know. He's a real estate investor and he's an active real estate investor and he does a good job and he likes investing in real estate. But he was like, hey, it would be nice if I could just be the lender and this, and instead of doing all the hard work and being the investor, I could just lend. And he started lending, and then he realized it's like, hey, I'm utilizing a lot of my capital that I would normally buy flips and cash for with this, and I'm lending and I'm making a smaller rate of return. And yes, there's less risk and stuff like that, but he was taking time away from his flipping business, and to him it didn't make the most sense. I mean, for all of us, like we wanted to get away from flipping and because it was hard and we wanted to be the lender, but he loved flipping and he was making substantially more money, but he had all this sideline money anyways. So he's like, I'm just going to find operators, a one-off operator or operators around the country to invest in, and I'll get 10% on that passive capital while I have my active capital working for me that can achieve a much higher rate of return than 20%.
Yeah. And I mean, the workload has a lot to do with it. The rate of return is a factor too. But also, guys, listen, like we just want to make sure that we're doing everything we can so that people don't lose money. Like if you're listening to this right now, we want you to never lose money by being a lender. And here are some of the ways in which people do. Like if you meet a couple rehabbers at the local meetup, real estate investor meetup group, and offer them 100% financing and don't really know what you're doing, and you don't do this full time, your money's at risk. Like, that's exactly how people get themselves in trouble. We had a lady email us recently where she was giving some very unsafe loans and terms and loan amounts to somebody, and they're starting to go sideways. There's a number of loans to one person. They're starting to go sideways, and she's emailing us for advice, and we're giving her the best advice we can. But like, we don't want this to happen to people out there. I'm in a Facebook group. It's not our group, but there's some private lenders in there, and I see people chatting about deals that they're doing on their own, and it is very, very clear that these people don't know what they're doing. And I just think to myself, like, shit, I hope they don't lose money. Be careful. Like, all kinds of crazy stuff. Not holding the construction fund, just giving them to it all at closing. They collect no borrower financials. They do not pull their credit report. They have a lien on the property, and like, that's about it. Do they have the right insurance to borrower? Who knows, right? Like, there's so many risks, and I see this stuff happening. It's a little bit, I mean, some people in our mastermind group are diving in to do this the right way. They're doing this full time or close to it. They're doing their homework. They're learning how to paper a file, service the deal, how to do it right. And that's cool. You want to get in the game? That's what we created the mastermind for, right? That's what we do this podcast for. And, unfortunately, there are some people that are just not going to go into it on that level to do it right, to learn. And there's some people that just aren't going to do it on that professional level. And those folks should be investing with a private lending company that they know, get to know and trust and like their deals. You should be, if you're not going to do it by the book, I would do it 10% passive with a proper lending company.
I remember years ago, and this is pre-institutional back capital, when we were lending, we were obviously a hard money lender. We were raising capital, and we had talked to a few. This was back when we were actually actively raising capital when we needed capital, years ago. And I remember talking to some private investors, and they're like, I'm not going to use you guys. You're only paying 9-10% rate of return. Like, I can get higher myself. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by yourself? And it's like, well, if I go out and I just lend it out directly to the flipper. And I'm like, you can, but like, you got to do it the right way, because if you lend a 15% rate of return to somebody and they don't pay you, or you don't get paid back and you lose money, like, what was the purpose of that when you could have just gotten a smaller passive rate of return? Doing it the right way. And I would see these lenders over time. And if you go on, state land records and tax records, you can see obviously recorded public instruments, right? Deeds of trust and mortgages on records and things like that. So I would see what these lenders would, not necessarily what their terms were, but how much they would lend. And it's like, hey, we quoted this borrower 130. They got a private investor through a self-directed IRA, or maybe just a one-off investor, lend them like 176. And like, we were quoted them 130, right? So, in essence, they needed probably 50, 60 grand with us. They needed nothing or something with this private lender. I'm like, oh my God, that's that. And I would, in essence, like, make a project of it. I would go circle back and look at some of these things. And a lot of them didn't work out, right? A lot of them didn't work out. And I see these passive and, these poor capital investors who thought the only thing they were chasing was a high interest rate return. That's what, right? That's all they were chasing. Right. And they would just, and they'd lose money once and they were out of the game. So like, we never had to compete with some of them, because like, they would do one deal for somebody, and next thing you know, that borrower would call us up again and say, hey, yeah, my capital, my private investor's out of the game. He's not lending anymore. It's like, that's because he lost money. Like, and it's not a joke. Like, it's serious. Everyone's just chasing that. Now, that's not to mean that if you're, somebody with capital and you want to lend and you do have a full-time job and you do have, that you can't do this. The purpose is follow some of the stuff that we talk about in the mastermind group and do it the right way, right? Like, underwrite this loan, go out to the property, meet the borrower, get all the documentation that's needed, that's needed. Use an attorney to do your loan docs. Do an attorney to use your title work. Make sure you get proper insurance in place. Like, follow the underwriting process and formula that we all follow, be professional and service it the right way, because that's what it takes to do a deal. And if you want to do that, absolutely do it, right? Like, there's no point to invest with another company if you actively want to do this yourself. Like, that's highly recommended, but just choose which one. And here's another real quick story, and I'm kind of hijacking this episode, but here's another real quick story. When we didn't realize this early on, but when we originally were out there raising capital in like 07, 08, 09, into 2010 and stuff like that, some of our best capital investors were other hard money lending companies that were lending their own money out.
Former lenders.
Or former lenders. And that wasn't even anybody that we originally thought to attract. But they kind of like the reason that we were able to utilize their capital is because we were able to find really good opportunities and good deals and keep it a very passive investment. So as deals would come into them personally, they would do those deals and they would charge whatever they wanted to charge to those borrowers. But all their other liquid capital that they had that they wanted to deploy, they would say, wow, like, you have better deals than we have. And you guys are just doing all the work. Or they'd be like, I don't want to deal with anything with construction. It's too much of a pain in the neck for me. So I'm happy to deploy that money with you guys because you guys can deal with that and you have a team to manage it and service it. But like, they would only pick the deals that they wanted to do that would come to them because they weren't full-time, operators, some of them. Like, they didn't have, tons of deal flow. And I mean, listen, we've done plenty of episodes of why it's so important to be a marketing machine and a deal flow machine to bring in good opportunities, because that's what helps raise capital when you have tons and tons of good opportunities. But like, that's just what it ended up being. Like, to this day, we have capital investors from 15 plus years ago that do lend their own money themselves, and they're set up to lend their own money themselves, but they don't have enough good deal flow to do so. So when opportunities come, they rather, they use their business as active income and they use our business model as passive income.
Yeah, we definitely did turn a few lenders into passive capital investors just by having the right deals. You're right. We didn't really expect that to happen. But anyway, point being, everybody, that, just take a hard look at the situation and be honest with yourself. Like, there's no right or wrong. Like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being a passive capital investor with a pro lending company. Or if you want to say, all right, I really want to dive in. I want to do this all right. I want to document my files properly. I want to do this like a professional and make all the points and interest rate return, then absolutely that's available to you too. I would just take a hard look at the situation, try to be smart, try to be safe. Like I said before, we don't want anybody out there in private lending world losing money. That's not what a first mortgage lender is supposed to be a risk of having happen to them. So, all right, guys, we appreciate you watching and listening. If you want to share this episode with anybody that might get value from the stuff that we're talking about, we would really, really appreciate that. And we'll see everyone here next time on the Private Lenders Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Private Lenders Podcast. Please note that the opinions stated by all the speakers on this show are only opinions and not intended for legal, financial, or accounting advice. Please make sure to always check with your own legal, accounting, and financial professionals. If you enjoyed this episode of the Private Lenders Podcast, we'd appreciate it if you would spread the word. Make sure to check out hardmoneymastermind.com, the #1 free community for new and experienced private and hard money lenders.